One of, if not the most important new presence introduced in Deltarune Chapter 5 is Flowery. I think we all knew we were going to get a flower related character in this chapter, but never in my wildest dreams that I suppose we'd receive something like this. Like, imagine showing Flowery to an Undertale fan back in 2015. They would absolutely scoff at you. And yet here we are over a decade later with this fucking guy. But despite that, Flowery has turned out to easily sweep over Deltarune's other antagonists, and claim his rightful spot as the best antagonist in the story thus far. He's genuinely such a refreshing antagonist to see in a story. He both perfectly fulfills his role and twists it into something new and uniquely meaningful to Deltarune's story. And in this video, I want to talk about that. So let's get this video underway. Or as Flowery would say,
"Here I come, San Francisco!"
Actually, maybe we don't need to hear what he'd say. Let's just get this underway. Now, back in my Tenna analysis, I thought Tenna's VH commercial introduction was unique, but little did I know what awaited for me with Flowery's introduction. Flowery's introduction is literally the style of an anime opening, where he dramatically announces his presence and reveals himself to Chris and Suzy. Immediately you get the vibe of a conventional anime protagonist from him, especially from the fact that he looks distinctly human compared to most Darkners, which even Suzy directly notes. His human appearance is only accentuated by the fact that he has actual voice clips.
Jerona!
And not just the typical voice blips that these characters usually use. That initial vibe you get from his anime protagonist status are definitely matched with the glimpse you see into his personality here. He consistently refers to Suzy with terms such as "milady" and "princess." His face has sparkles shining next to him, and he even kisses Suzy's hands, which makes a flower with his face sprout. All of this makes him appear very much like a White Knight sort of character, which of course can make him a very annoying character upon first impression. The main cast definitely emphasized with that first impression, as both Suzy and Ralsei immediately are annoyed by him. The other thing that this scene, and many scenes in the future establish, is his bond with Asgore. He describes himself as "your dad's best friend," and Flowery appeals himself to Asgore by trying to offer him a paradise to live in. Flowery spends a lot of this chapter trying to show Asgore a lot of his own lost fantasies that he never got to fulfill in his actual life. For example, he presents Asgore with a cowboy show pretty early on, and later lets Asgore learn how to ride a skateboard. Both of these are some of Asgore's old wishes that he never got to do in the light world. Although every time Asgore comes close to discussing topics of the past, like his family, Flowery will either cut or shift the conversation to move on, serving essentially as a distraction for him. For that reason, he also often hides the fun gang away from Asgore, particularly Chris and Ralsei, since Chris is Asgore's child and Ralsei strongly resembles Asriel. Throughout the early part of the fun gang's adventure, Flowery will often swoop in and give assistance, or as he calls it, helping some princesses in distress. It only really contributes to the initial impression we had of him of an idolized White Knight, as he always effortlessly solves any issues the fun gang might be having. When dealing with the Floridans, he immediately resolves the love trials with ease. Or when dealing with the puzzle that's meant to require 4 people, he solves it fully himself, and in style too. Although both Suzy and Ralsei both don't like Flowery at first, Ralsei especially is set up to be at odds with Flowery, as he's the one who is constantly ticked off by every little thing Flowery does. It starts with Ralsei noting that Flowery has maximum stats and gave himself 999 in everything. This, among many other more obvious connections, parallels him to Flowey pretty strongly, but we'll discuss that more later in this analysis. For now, I mostly want to note that Ralsei and Flowery are particularly put at odds often around the more meta elements of the game. It starts with the max stats thing that I mentioned before, and then shifts to Flowery and Ralsei telling you to turn each other's voices off in the config menu, which admittedly is pretty funny. Flowery gives a lot more intel on the diegetic game elements than Ralsei often does though, which we see most of how he told Suzy about voice clips and battle icons before Ralsei did. It's apparent to see Ralsei's envy towards Flowery because in a lot of ways, Flowery is just him but better. And even at this stage, we can already see how it's not just because Ralsei is innately inferior to Flowery or anything like that, but rather because Ralsei often just holds back and limits himself to following the established rules. In a similar way that Flowery breezes through puzzles the main cast struggle with, Ralsei can instantly solve this puzzle because he doesn't feel like wasting time on it. This dynamic is absolutely the most interesting in the chapter for me, and although there's already a lot to say on it right now, we'll shelve this deeper discussion for later once the dynamics actually fully explored. Very early on into the adventure, Flowery offers something that no antagonist before him has offered, which is an early return to the light world. Flowery forewarns that if we were to continue further into this dark world, things might become troublesome. Despite his warning, we move onwards, and he keeps warning us multiple times that he'll have to stop us if we continue down this path. He says that for Asgore's happiness, it's best if Asgore never sees Chris again, and that he and the rest of the flowers can deal with everything from here. Aqua later mentions that Flowery desires to give Asgore an ideal world, which makes it become quickly apparent that this is his main motivation. Now, of course, as protagonists who have to prevent darkness from overflowing, we obviously can't accept this, but even now, there's a lot of seeds, no pun intended, of doubt implanted into the characters. Susie in particular begins to question more about what the flowers exactly are, wondering how it must feel to be a flower who desires to be human, and she expresses doubt multiple times over whether or not the flowers are really bad guys, especially if all they want to do is just make Asgore happy. These become fully realized when they reach the Flower Castle, which we'll get to now. At Flower Castle, Flowery continues to try and entertain Asgore, but Asgore becomes more obsessed with his duty in proving himself right. Flowery tries to take multiple actions to try and dissuade Asgore from this, such as blowing away the papers he's researching Dark Worlds on, or discouraging him from thinking about his old family, and encouraging him to hang out with his new family, or the boys as Flowery calls it. Asgore does initially try to play along with Flowery's attempts, but as he becomes more set on proving himself, he stops doing that and begins shutting himself off from the rest of the flowers. It is interesting though that although Flowery does this, and acts somewhat similarly to Tenna in Chapter 3, when Asgore demands to go to the fountain, Flowery does not actually push back, and does what Asgore asks of him. We see this a few times throughout the story, but although Flowery does strongly implore Asgore to consider his flowers' care, they ultimately prioritize Asgore's desires over what they want, even though this evidently makes all of the flowers feel sad. Now, the dynamic that I already found the most interesting in this chapter, Flowery and Ralsei's dynamic, only continues to get more interesting in this section. What you often see with Flowery in this section, and especially with what Flowery says to Ralsei, is that Flowery actually brings up better points than Ralsei, and is usually the one I think is more right in any given conversation. Ralsei and Flowery's first notable interaction is Ralsei questioning why Flowery can be so relaxed, because the Fun Gang is going to steal their fountain, insisting that these dark worlds are bad. Flowery then questions to Ralsei that then isn't the person who made this dark world a bad person because of that, obviously knowing that Chris made this fountain. And I mean, by Ralsei's own logic, Flowery isn't even all that wrong here, which is probably why Ralsei doesn't have a good response to him. Their next interaction starts with Flowery interrupting Ralsei, who is praying for things to go well. Ralsei questions, like in the last interaction, why Flowery isn't bothered by the Fun Gang, but Flowery just responds that by Chris and Susie escaping the prison, they made friends with the flowers, getting closer to mutual understanding. Flowery questions why Ralsei is praying in the first place, asking why Ralsei doesn't just put his faith in himself. Ralsei fires back at him by saying his faith is nothing like Flowery's arrogance, insisting he can't defeat anyone, and if Ralsei let himself go down like him, he could burn Flowery down in an instant. Flowery says that he hasn't though, and because in some way, Ralsei is hoping for Flowery to win and defy fate. Flowery then offers drink vouchers for Ralsei, who begins wondering what Chris and Susie would like before Flowery implores Ralsei to choose what he wants. This interaction in particular is super fascinating, and helps show the fundamental conflict between the two. Ralsei tends to be frustrated on why Flowery never seems affected by the Lightner's progress, especially because Ralsei believes that Flowery stands no real chance against the Fun Gang. This is what Ralsei chalks up to as arrogance on Flowery's part, but I don't think that's what this really is. Flowery is not arrogant, but rather he just has self-confidence and self-respect, something he mentions that Ralsei notably lacks. To me, this conflict between them reminds me very much of the psychological concept known as the locus of evaluation, which is something that humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers came up with. As psychologylexicon.com defines it, quote, "The locus of evaluation in psychology refers to the source from which individuals draw their judgments about themselves and their actions." The definition continues to state that, quote, "The locus of evaluation can either be internal or external." An internal locus of evaluation means that one's self-worth comes based on their own values, morals, and beliefs. On the other hand, an external locus of evaluation implies that one's self-worth comes from external factors like other people's expectations. These two concepts are extremely applicable to Flowery and Ralsei, because Flowery fundamentally puts his faith in himself first and foremost, and believes in fulfilling his own hopes and dreams. Ralsei, on the other hand, literally prays to a higher power for guidance. And I mean, by now we have an infinite amount of examples of Ralsei disregarding his own relevance and opinions in favor of Lightners that listing them all would actually be impossible. I would definitely also say the adjacent psychological concept of the locus of control, The belief one has in how much the outcomes in their life are due to their own actions or external forces also applies to Ralsei and Flowery. Ralsei unwaveringly upholds his belief that the prophecy is unchangeable, which fits with the external locus of control, since the external believes that outcomes are outside of their own control, and are instead up to other things like higher powers, fate, or luck. Flowery, on the other hand, indirectly refutes Ralsei by calling him an impossibility, and generally he seems to fit with the internal locus of control, deciding events and outcomes through his own will. This particular part of Flowery's character becomes more prominent given some of his future dialogue, so I want to take a look at those next. In the last section of Flower Castle, Flowery and the rest of the flowers vow to halt you, but as Blue says, it's not in hatred, but rather as a contest of their love. Flowery calls this the true power of friendship, insisting that he will triumph over us with that compared to our husk of companionship. This is a very anime thing to say, which fits with his character, but once again, is he really wrong? Our main trio is filled with a cast of friends who, while they do strongly treasure each other, also often have their own agendas or emotions at play that compromise their relationships. The flowers, on the other hand, are united in their dream, and if this was the fairy tale that Flowery is engaging in, Flowery probably would win this encounter. This is an overarching theme I mentioned about Flowery a lot, but even though he is an antagonist to us, so oftentimes he's more aware of the themes than our cast is. One of my favorite interactions with Flowery is one where Ralsei insists they have to seal this dark fountain, because if there's too many it invites the end of the world. Flowery responds by questioning why they don't take away the Castle Town fountain then, and one of my favorite lines from him is when he says this. Susie responds by saying that they can't give it up because it's their home, but that only really loops back to what Blue said before all of this started. There is no hate on either side, they're both competing to protect what's precious to them, to protect each of their fantasies. And ultimately, are either the Funging or the Flowers' fantasies more important than the other? No. Although the prophecy is potentially world-ending if or if not followed, that does not at all diminish the Flowers' earnest desire to give Asgore his ideal world after the love he showed to them. And eventually, Flowery and the Funging have to fight head to head, and in this boss fight, we learn a lot of interesting things. Right before Flowery's boss fight, he reveals his origin to us. Beyond just being the flowers in Asgore's shop, these flowers were made for a wedding bouquet that Asgore proposed to Toriel with. These flowers weren't meant to last longer than a day, but Asgore cared for them, and extended their lives by virtue of that care. Flowery laments during multiple points of struggle in Asgore's life that they could do nothing, and so the reason they want to give Asgore this wonderful world is to repay him for the kindness he gave them. This motive actually explains quite a few things about Flowery. Firstly, his ideal, overbearing, and white knight identity makes a lot more sense given his origin. I mean, he was literally used by Asgore to propose to Toriel, who is someone who tends to barge into her life regardless of what she wants. This is a parallel that the story itself even acknowledges shortly after, as Asgore literally tells Flowery that he now understands what it's like to be burdened by unwanted affection. Secondly, this reveals that Flowery's main insecurity is fundamentally wanting to avoid being inadequate, or useless as he describes. During his death, his main lament is his feeling of uselessness towards being unable to deal with the night and save Asgore. But we still have a few points to address within the main boss battle itself before we get to that point. I think the most interesting part of Flowery's boss fight is the pains it goes to make Flowery mimic many of the battle options that only our main party has been able to do at this point, enhancing that feeling of Flowery feeling like his own protagonist. Before the battle starts, we literally see him gain power from his own recruits, with recruits being something only we have had access to until this point. During the battle, he literally does his own act and manages to increase our mercy meter, which again, only our main party is known for being able to do. And later in the evidence section, when we present evidence against him, he presents his own evidence against us and manages to get Ralsei out of the fight from it. All these things Flowery done were distinctly player actions before this, and that makes Flowery feel like more than just an antagonist. It's not just his game actions that leave that impression though, but also his rhetoric during this fight. Before the battle, Flowery expresses the belief that he thought we held the power to defy fate and avoid this showdown. And as he says in the battle, he wanted us to get to know the flowers so we might not attempt to seal the fountain. He ultimately stands up for his dreams though, and he even echoes this game's themes of friendship, for relying on all of the other flowers during this battle. And at the very end, he becomes Omega Flowery, who is the ultimate representation of power for Flowery, literally all of the other flowers combined. This is of course a walking Asriel parallel, but again, we will get there when we get there. At this battle's climax, Omega Flowery faces you down, but at the end he hesitates, which allows Chris to win the exchange. I personally think this could be alluding to two possible things. Either it fully proves that Flowery was not ever really against Chris and co, as he hesitates here and doesn't really want to hurt Chris, or it proves that Flowery was always bound to the prophecy in the end, as Flowery is fated to lose to us, and him hesitating is a result of fate granting us the opportunity for victory. It also might just be a mixture of both, but I honestly can't fully tell, so please let me know in the comments what you think about this. It's also interesting to note with Flowery's loss that until this point, all of Flowery's sprites have been in black and white, but these last sprites, with his eyes open, have partial color in his eye. I personally think this is symbolic for a lot of things. Most likely, this is a metaphor for him literally opening up his eyes to reality, both to the fact that while he's presented himself as a human to this point, he ultimately knows that he is not really human, because although not necessarily a Darkner as we learn later, he is also not a fully fledged Lightner. And also to the fact that Asgore does not really want to stay in this world, and he learns that his affection toward Asgore is not taken as well as he would have hoped. Although despite that, unlike Tenno before him, he does not crash out at the revelation that Asgore didn't treasure him in the same way that Flowery did, and he chooses to protect and support Asgore even still. Ultimately, Flowery has to reckon with the fact that our dream prevailed, but also he realizes that this was inevitable. These flowers could not last in the darkness, but he was happy enough to just give Asgore a glimpse of that perfect world, to repay even an iota of the kindness that Asgore gave them. He shows that his dream was always about Asgore's feelings first, even if he does not perfectly act like what Asgore wants. And Flowery proves that fact even more when Asgore gets taken by the Knight, and despite knowing he would die for the Knight from Ralsei telling him earlier, he still follows his fate and tries to fight the Knight, even knowing he was literally scripted to lose. Flowery's standoff against the Knight was low-key the most hyped part of the chapter, but we see how his max stats are ultimately fake, as his damage is slashed to 0, and the Knight effortlessly defeats him. And as I said earlier in this section, he laments his own powerlessness, and we can see how he's impacted Ralsei, because even knowing Flowery is doomed, Ralsei tries healing him regardless, because Ralsei now feels the need to try, even if it is fated to not work out. With all this laid out about Flowery, it's finally time for me to acknowledge the fact that most Undertale fans realize upon first hearing his name, which is that Flowery is a massive reference to Flowey. His name is Flowey's with an extra letter, and even that name is based on a nickname Papyrus came up for Flowey in Undertale. His theme is called Your Dad's Best Friend, while Flowey's theme is called Your Best Friend. In the real world, Flowery is a golden flower, the exact same as Flowey's actual design. Additionally, some of his flying poses perfectly match Azriel's poses, and God forbid do I have to mention Omega Flowery? The story is not at all subtle about this, but what's the point of all these references? To me, these parallels ultimately serve to highlight the fundamental difference between these two characters. In Undertale, Flowey was a soulless monster, one who looked down on the rest of the world as being filled with NPCs and predictable lines of dialogue. Even when he harnessed the powers of others, like the prior fallen humans for example, he does this against their will, and ultimately we win the Omega Flowey fight through forging a stronger connection with them than he did. Flowery, by contrast, possesses a human design, and rather than looking down on others, he comments many times that he respects the Fun Gang and their dreams. And the biggest difference between him and Flowey is that he has true friendship. As Omega Flowery, he combines all of the flowers' strength into a unified hope, and even before that he works together with them in his battle. But of course, there's more going on with these parallels than just the power of friendship and cherishing others, because both Flowey and Flowery have a unique relationship with the meta-narrative. As I mentioned before, Flowey views his world like a game filled with predictable NPCs, and in many ways is designed to reflect the player, and from his viewpoint, he is a player-like entity. He overrides the game many times to give himself more power by taking control of the other souls, and will treat your actions similarly to how you would, as someone with an innate morbid curiosity for exploring secret content. Flowery also plays the role of a protagonist, but rather than reflecting the gamer protagonist, he more reflects a conventional hero or anime protagonist. He also explicitly uses fake stats and possesses a meta-awareness that few others do, and bends that stuff to his will. The main difference between Flowery and Flowey is that while Flowey actually does have a power similar to the player, Flowery does not. Flowery clearly knows of the prophecy, given how he mentions multiple times that he knows that the Fun Gang and him are destined to clash. Despite that, he hopes for it to change and for us to make the decision to not shatter the flower's fantasies. And while Flowery says he's human and acts like a human, he is just a flower given a higher conscience, and that is why his eyes are partially filled with color. His protagonist persona is likely something he follows because it exudes a sense of overwhelming strength and power, which he notably felt like he was lacking before. All of this is to say, he's basically just the ultimate LARPer, but while he can't be the true hero that he's presenting as, he still tried his best to repay Asgore back. He and the others were just flowers that lasted longer than a day, longer than they were supposed to, sprouting in this world through love. And for that, even if he is a LARPer, he's my LARPer. After all this discussion about Flowery and his character and how he relates to others, the most important question after all this is, well, what was the point of any of this? What does his existence specifically highlight about the story's messages? And I think what Flowery is emphasizing is something important for Ralsei's character going forward, and highlighting the path he should take in his future. At its core, Flowery and Ralsei's conflict comes from a struggle with identity in relation to one's purpose. Ralsei, for all intents and purposes, makes his purpose, that is, his role in the prophecy and status as a Darkner, his identity. He is aware that he himself is only really an NPC in the story, lesser than the Lightners, and limits his role to that of a helpful NPC. That is why he dedicates so much of his existence to serving others, because to him, that is his identity. Flowery also knows that his purpose is to serve as an antagonist, and then die to the night, that he is just a flower. But unlike Ralsei, he does not make that his identity. Rather, he chooses his identity as a human, pretending to be like a Lightner human and his own protagonist, ultimately believing in himself and becoming more than his purpose. This difference is what Ralsei fundamentally cannot stand, and what Ralsei needs to learn to grow as a character, to become his own person. This is why Ralsei tells Flowery directly that he is not a human, and that his purpose is to just be a flower. But as Flowery tells him, he can't be happy thinking like that. Ralsei as a character has always been about his deep-seated belief that Darkner's purpose is to serve Lightners. And although Ralsei has gone through a lot with both Chris and Susie, and despite Susie's own hope to break fate, Ralsei has still not let this go. And I mean, that makes sense, because this belief is just so core to his character. And from his perspective, is it even wrong? I mean, he was right about Flowery in the end. Despite Flowery's attempts to try and defy fate and avoid his dream from being shattered, we did just that. It didn't matter that he knew he died to the night, because Flowery died to the night anyways of his own accord, so he ultimately just followed his preset path. But even though all of that is technically true, what Ralsei has to learn, and what I believe that he is starting to learn from Flowery, is that even if things end up as he expects, he should still choose the identity that he wants and fulfill his own desires, even if it goes against the prophecy or his role as a Darkner. Because although Flowery met his fated end, he died fighting for his fantasy, and had true belief in himself and his values until the very end, despite knowing what was likely to happen. Flowery didn't defy fate by actively trying to work against it, but rather just by being himself in spite of knowing what would happen. And ultimately, I think that is what Deltarune is trying to teach us through Flowery. Hi, hello. As I said at the start of this video, Flowery is genuinely one of the most refreshing and compelling antagonists I've seen in media for quite a long time. My favorite antagonists in general are ones who at times feel like their own protagonists, and with Flowery in particular, his character is centered around foiling our cast by just having as valid a points as they often do. It makes him infinitely more engaging compared to how many other stories write their antagonists, and it shows how Toby has a delightful understanding of the fact that being an antagonist doesn't mean being a villain or being in the wrong. But with all that said, if you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe to help boost my small channel in the YouTube algorithm. If you have your own thoughts on Flowery, or just Chapter 5 in general, then please leave them down in the comments below. But other than that, take care.